Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be talking about the most notable controversies within World of Warcraft. Why? Well, hindsight is 2020, and reflecting upon history and what actually went down can be a very instructive exercise. The goal here is to highlight some of the largest controversies and discuss why they were so, and to attempt to take a more considered look at the situation. This isn't meant to be some sort of poppy clickbait video. This is basically just 5 sort of short video essays bundled into one thing and some, I think, pretty interesting topics. Ultimately, there's nothing wrong with coming to a different conclusion and having a different opinion. I think what is important with all of this stuff is that there is some form of discussion. I think that still is kind of needed because a few of these are decently controversial to this day. Now, I'm going to kick it off with something from quite a while back. This is a decision that really defined the direction of World of Warcraft since Wrath of the Lich King in many ways. This might be strange to new players, but I'm talking about LFD. It used to be that all group formation was done via the in-game chat. There was a group finder, and there was even a group finding chat channel. You could list your interest for a dungeon with the group finder, but it wasn't that robust, really, or that effective. All in all, finding a dungeon group was a very manual experience. And then a patch came along that changed all of that. Instead of spending time forming a group and traveling to the dungeon, you would instead hit a button on the UI. You'd wait perhaps 10 minutes, and then you'd be teleported right into a random one of those dungeons. The split in the player base with this really came down to the sense of server community, I think. Many people at the time thought that something was lost when your server no longer really mattered, because at the time, this was across your entire battle group, and then it was later made regional. And indeed, people thought it would be harder to make lasting relationships when many of the social interactions from the game were removed. And I think they're actually not wrong there. To this day, it's rare that you get a random conversation happen in one of the random group finder dungeons. Now, of course, the benefits from this are really apparent. With the social and time barriers removed, a lot more dungeons were ran overall. And this system was added at a time where players had a lot of gear, which meant that the dungeons were just a complete face roll. Plus, you could farm up badges through these, which could be used to purchase gear far more effectively, and it overall just sort of struck at this particular time where you could grind out a lot of dungeons, gear up new characters, and I think it saw heavy participation. Overall, I do agree though that something was lost socially, and that this might have damaged one of the core MMO pillars of World of Warcraft. However, I think the usability benefits of the LFD system were tremendous. A large part of the problem was that we didn't have something like the pre-made group finder or content, I think, akin to Mythic Plus. As most heroic dungeons at the time, they were just such a face roll, you never needed to talk to anyone, bar perhaps the ICC dungeons. And oddly enough, I did have a few good times with randoms in those ICC 5-man dungeons, because the greater difficulty did mean more communication had to happen, and that was quite enjoyable, but of course those people would just disappear back to their server after all. I think LFD overall was a good thing for the game, but the Blizzard should have thought more about the social upshots and just the social elements and aspects at the time, and then also moving forward with some of their designs, because really for quite a while they just sort of missed the mark with that stuff. And the next thing is Cataclysm Heroes. Now, these are such an interesting topic. To this day, one of my favorite bits of content in the game. Absolutely love them, even more than I like Mythic Plus today, due to how they were methodical, they were thoughtful, rather than this massive AoE speedrun. However, they tie perfectly into our previous topic. Cataclysm Heroics were awesome because they required communication. You had to CC mobs and take pulls one mob at a time. There were bosses that could absolutely kill you if you didn't know what you were doing and if you messed up. There was a lot more problem solving involved in the gameplay of this content, and it really made you use your class's toolkit more. Doing these with your guild was just a dream. They honestly, especially at the start with lower gear, they felt like raiding light. However, they were not designed for LFD, that much is for sure. Cataclysm Heroics were really by far the hardest content that Blizzard had ever put through a random queued system like that. Moreover, it was after an expansion where people thought that doing a dungeon involved pulling multiple packs of mobs with little regard for their mechanics or really anything at all. Now, sure, those of us who were on MMO Champion knew what was up. We knew this content was tricky. We'd probably seen Ghostcrawler's really long blog post on the topic. But for the vast majority of players, they had no idea. They tried to apply their Wrath of the Lich King dungeoneering habits to a system that was the same in name, but very, very different in practice and in balance, and they died. They died a lot. Queue times ballooned, of course. I remember waiting an hour and a half for an LFD heroic at one point, which, sucked, and I just went back to doing it with my guild. Blizzard, really, they quite quickly changed pace. The dungeons were nerfed, and random groups had a flat increase to their throughput to compensate for them going through that queued system. This meant the dungeons, once again, they were a bit of a face roll for the most part. I think the real damage here is more that it scared Blizzard away from doing challenging dungeon content as a means of character progression, and really they were scared away from that for years. Mists of Pandaria tried to recapture part of the feeling with challenge mode dungeons, but they never really caught on because of the speedrun nature, the normalization of your stats, so there wasn't really much progress, and then the lack of a gear reward, so it didn't matter to your core character progression. I think it's really nice to see Blizzard revisit the idea in Legion with Mythic Plus, but what I really miss is the problem solving and the teamwork that was created by having hourglass toolkits be used to plan and control the fight. I think the game would be more fun if more of our CC abilities were more important and were actually called upon by the encounter design. But that really is my takeaway from that. I'm glad that they've came back to doing harder content for small groups of players. Now, for the longest time in World of Warcraft, it was thought of as being better than a free-to-play game, fundamentally because it was an uncompromised a la carte experience. And then the Celestial Steed came along. That was a massive, massive bloody moment for the game. So it was the first time that we would see Blizzard sell a mount, something that was really at the time seen as being a form of core content, as a microtransaction. Not that $25 is micro by any means. Now, I think that being against this was a justified position to have now and back at that time, but it is important to keep in mind Blizzard as a business, and we need to think about it from that perspective. Profit is important to them, past their obligation to their shareholders. There is, of course, staff to be paid and insured, buildings to run, all of that stuff. Things like the mount store, in my view, are very hard to defend from a purely game design basis. They just don't make sense from that regard. But when you think about the economics, they're clearly an insane amount of value for the company. Think about it, you're making a new rig, a new model, a new skin, you chuck it into the store, you get multiple months worth of subscription from many players. Plus, the model and the rig can be reused in the future. It really is very efficient. So, with that very clear financial argument in mind, let's talk about the game design one. I think it's undeniable that mounts can be a very compelling bit of content for players to earn, and Warlords of Draenor is a very good example of that kind of going wrong. The core game of Warlords had a lot of reskins of simple mounts such as boars, while more complex mounts that were themed around the expansion like the Fey Dragon, the Iron Sky Screamer, and the Ravager, they were left as store mounts. Now imagine if Warlords of Draenor, similar to the Cloud Serpent faction, had content surrounding those three mounts, maybe surrounding the Fey Dragon mount. You know, it wouldn't save the expansion, but it would certainly have given players a few more things to do. Now, one thing that has been interesting, and one thing that I actually commend Blizzard for, is there seems to have been a slowdown on the mount store. Blizzard have not added a new mount to the store since, and we've actually seen an uptick in the amount of unique mount models in this expansion. Now, of course, there have been a few, free-to-play, or Heroes of the Storm events and stuff like that, which, maybe it's not the best thing, but I kind of get why it's being done. So perhaps we are reaching more of a balance with that stuff, where it doesn't feel like mounts are being yanked out of the core game content, specifically for the store. Now, that said, there have been a few more promotion mounts, like the Hearth Steed and the more recent one for Heroes of the Storm. I'd be interesting to see if they, long-term wise, think there's more value in that than the upfront $25. Alright, with that covered, it's Panda time. Mists of Pandaria was divisive as hell, right off the heels of defeating the ruler of the undead and a world-ending dragon. We were heading off to what many people perceive to be Kung Fu Panda in game form or something like that. Well, when the expansion dropped, I think it was pretty clear that there was more to it than Kung Fu Panda. We did have some serious characters with interesting stories to tell, and a really good layer, in my opinion, of lore operating underneath the entire thing. But still, many people found it hard to take the pandas seriously, which is fair enough, and when we look at how Blizzard portrayed them, it's completely understandable. Often the pandas were the subject of jokes, constantly getting drunk, acting the fool, and when you looked at the animation style, it was less Bruce Lee and more Drunken Master, and both those things are great, but maybe something more lulzy isn't what people wanted from Warcraft. Now, I think that it might have just been a case where it wasn't the best fit for World of Warcraft, but it might have had many of its own merits. Now, for me personally, I always loved the art style of Pandaria. I kind of like that stuff anyway. Yeah, it wasn't unique, certainly, but I did think it was visually quite fantastic. What's the takeaway with all the Pandaria stuff? Well, I think it is actually a lesson of community perception and marketing. Perhaps what Blizzard did is they beefed up that jovial stuff for their marketing to hit a wider crowd, but ended up shooting themselves in the foot when it came to their core audience. Pandaria, of course, had a pretty legendary drop-off. Overall, I think there was a lot to like about MoP, especially its aggressive patch cycle, which delivered fresh content pretty much every 3 months, bar, the 14-month Siege of Orgrimmar wait, but I think it is something that is more about their marketing and the perceptions they fostered, maybe a little bit less about the actual content itself. That said, I would have liked overall a more serious tone for the pandas, and something that was taking that and bringing it into Warcraft and making it feel like it was something within Warcraft rather than like it was, I don't know, just tonally kind of inconsistent with the rest of what players had came to expect from the franchise. So we've covered a lot of really in-game stuff in this video. Let's go more meta with real ID and real names. I think this might have been the most irate I've ever seen players, and, in my view, for very good reason indeed. Blizzard unveiled their plan to force people to use their real names on the forums. Their goal was, or their idea was, that without anonymity, people would be nicer to each other and there would be less toxic behavior overall. The counterpoints to this were quite ranging. First, it is the internet. It has operated with screen names being the norm for a long time. I don't mean to invoke the is-ought argument here, but that is worth bearing in mind. Plus, within MMOs and RPGs, people would often identify by their avatar name. That was kind of their identity there. For a lot of people, gaming is a separate thing from their real-life affairs, and they would rather go by whatever name they choose, so they're not, carrying in their real-life baggage and connections into their relaxing time. Plus, it's very easy to track someone down, especially if you can cross-reference someone's full name with that of the people who they actually associate with in real life. I also think that forcing that link between public and private life is something that shouldn't be forced upon you. It's something that should be up to individuals. As for cutting down on harassment, well, let's be real, dedicated trolls are not going to care about this. They might even be happy, have been happy, because they would have thought, well, things have got more of a sting if it comes from a real name, and they would have just made new accounts when old ones got banned. I think it might have given some people a bit of pause when it came to, being nasty, which might have been good, but I think overall it would have been at too high of a cost. Overall, I understand why they want to do this. I just think it's against the core of what a kind of virtual world is anyway. It's supposed to be a place where your character is who you are, who you're known by. If people want a social network with their real name, Facebook already exists. Blizzard don't have to enter that arena. The topic of, I think, combating toxicity and all of that stuff is definitely interesting overall. As the official forums, if you've been to them, they can be a pretty dire place. But overall, I think that certainly was not the right way for Blizzard to go. And I think there we have it, a look back through 5 of the more controversial things to happen in the history of the game. There are many other topics to cover. Gear score is one that immediately comes to mind, so I will do a similar video kind of in a later date. I love doing these video essay type videos. I think something like this is a great format for covering a handful of interesting topics in a concise manner, so be sure to let me know what your take is on these topics. But yeah, guys, thanks for watching. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and I'll see you next time.